Through TwinCam, I've made a bit of a name for exploring and resuscitating the memory of some of history's most derided cars. The media has a tendency to patronise based on conjecture and rumour and create inescapable reputations and infamy. And infamous, this one really is, because this is the Lancia Beta Berliner. Before we get into it though, this car is to be auctioned by Manor Park Classics, so if you fancy a piece of Italian motoring history and the ultimate in nerdy conversation starters, then please do follow the link in the description. Before the Beta itself, let's take a moment to think about Lancia. If you're British in particular, you'll view them in one of two ways. If you're a car enthusiast, it's all about the Stratos and the Delta Integrale. We're 6 inches from losing fingers as our eyes are filled with dust as Volterole or Carlos Sainz thunder past, piloting some of the most deified rally cars of all time. Otherwise, you'll be thinking of the Beta, and well, we'll get to that later. But in the 1960s, all this was still to come, as Lancia was building the remarkable Fulvia. The Fulvia is a car you cannot help but love, but a combination of quirky engineering and a high price pushed Lancia to the brink of bankruptcy, and they were bought by Fiat in 1969. The Fulvia was 6 years old by this point, and with no replacement in the works, it was paramount that something was started. And within only 3 years, a staggeringly short period for an all-new car, Lancia debuted the Beta. This car was supposed to be a fresh start for Lancia, breaking away from the Fulvia's engineering but retaining a sense of Lancia heritage, starting with its market placement and front drive tradition, but also going back to the tradition of Vincenzo Lancia himself, who always named his cars after letters of the Greek alphabet. So the first Fiat-owned Lancia would be the Beta. But before we get into Fiat and perception and all that good stuff, we need to learn what we mean by Lancia Beta, because it's a surprisingly vague term. As with the old Fulvia, the name didn't just refer to the four-door saloon, the Beta Berliner we have with us today. In 1973, Lancia added the Beta Coupe to the range, with a shorter wheelbase and a totally new body. Even the door handles were different. Shortly after, we met the Pininfarina designed and Zagato built Beta Spider, a convertible version of the coupe, but this trio still resembles a sensible range of cars, and that's about to change. Next along was the Lancia HPE, not officially a Beta to be fair, but it was clearly a Beta coupe with the Berliner's wheelbase and a shooting brake rear end. They didn't do a 5-door Beta estate, but a 3-door high-performance estate. It gets worse. In 1980, 8 years after the launch of the Berliner, Lancia launched the Beta Trevi, which is another 4-door saloon but more conservative and uglier. But the pinnacle of both the Beta range and the Beta madness was 1975's Lancia Beta Monte Carlo. Not 2 words like it should be, but that's the least of our worries. The Monte Carlo was a spectacularly exotic 2-seat sports car, which again looks nothing like any of the other Betas. But the Monte Carlo was also mid-engined, which meant it didn't actually have all that much in common with the other Betas, and made it something of an upmarket Fiat X19, but the Fiat was prettier. To be fair to Lancia, having all these cars on sale was perfectly sensible, but they marketed them all under the same name for most of their lives, which arguably devalues the sportier variants and is something you'd never see a manufacturer do today. But they're all topics for another day, so back to the Berliner, and as I mentioned, it's staggering how quickly Fiat and Lancia managed to get this car out. I can't seem to find all that much about the Beta's development, but with this time frame, I'd suggest that one of the two companies already had the basics of this car on the drawing board. It would make sense for it to be Fiat because they loved a McPherson strut by this stage, as we'll mention in a bit, but it also made sense for it to be a Lancia because they loved front-wheel drive. So if you can enlighten us all, then please do leave a comment below. But in either case, the Beta's engineering is intriguing, especially with our 50 years of hindsight. Lancia in the 60s was a bit of a funny company because while we all know they ended the decade in financial ruin and were saved by Fiat, it's difficult to pigeonhole exactly what kind of cars they made. Because there's no doubt they were enthusiast driven, but they were mechanically curious, achieving family cars in a way no other manufacturer did and no other manufacturer ever has since. Lancias were, by their very nature, a bit weird, combining all that with a premium image and very high prices. So while the Fulvia ironed out a few of those kinks in the chase for profits, it did retain a sense of enthusiasm-led. In the interest of understanding what that Lancia quirkiness meant, we'll just compare this Beta against its father. And the Fulvias really were off-canter in terms of engineering, but they were brilliant. And in whichever body style you chose, they were beautiful. The 60s and early 70s were exciting if you were into engineering, because the majority of manufacturers were still playing around and experimenting with all kinds of different suspension, steering and engine setups. But I wouldn't usually mention that, because if you forget this historical fact, you might be lured into the idea that the Beta was just a Fiat in drag. However, it is understandable why people may have thought that in the immediacy of the Beta's launch, because these things are absolutely 100% different under the skin. But they had to be, because the Fulvia was set up in a curious manner, and its physical components were quite old-fashioned on paper, with leaf springs and a steering box. For that reason, it makes sense for us in 2023 to hear that those were swapped for a steering rack and McPherson struts. But back in 1972, struts were still not quite the done thing. Ford had been using them for ages, but almost everyone else was still doing their own thing, many of them with double wishbones or torsion bars. And with Fiat having recently gone mad for struts, it's understandable why having struts all round may have been perceived as an example of Fiat dictatorship. Fortunately for us, our 50 years of hindsight tell us that they're probably the best overall option. And struts at the back are borderline exotic. Plus, a strut is just a method of springing and damping, because the manner in which the struts are actuated is actually quite similar to the leaves in the Fulvia. Single wishbones in the front and transverse arms at the back. So I'd suggest that Lancia retained a degree of freedom in designing this car, even if it does look like a Fiat on paper. But under the bonnet is where the Fiat influence becomes severely obvious, because this engine has nothing to do with Lancia. You see, traditionally, Lancia had used flat fours or narrow angle V4s. The Fulvia's V4, for example, was a brilliant, powerful little engine, plus it was only 5 years old by the time the Beta was launched. Yet, for the sake of rationalisation, it had to go in the bin. But don't think for a second that this was a problem for the Beta, because we're yet to meet a man named Aurelio Lampredi. Lampredi made his name at Ferrari in the 50s before being snatched away by Fiat and becoming responsible for some of the fizziest, most exotic performing mainstream road car engines we'd ever seen. While in Turin, Lampredi lent his name to 2 Fiat engines, the little single overhead cam lump I fell in love with in the back of the X19 and the larger twin cam engine in our Beta. This power unit is one of the greatest engines of all time, not just for its performance in factory road cars, but because of its performance in rallying and racing, as well as becoming the go-to engine swap for 4-cylinder cars for decades to come. The twin cam has been around since 1966, and for an engine fitted in run-of-the-mill family cars, it must have been staggering back then. Not only for its dual overhead camshafts, but also its aluminium cylinder head. In this Beta 1600 it produces about 100 brake horsepower, which isn't at all groundbreaking, but it's perfectly respectable for what is a family saloon from 50 years ago. The engineering of the Beta, therefore, was already something of a known quantity, and save for the fiercest Lancia traditionalists, wouldn't have been a surprise. What I think was surprising, though, was the styling. The Fulvia and larger Flavia were incredibly traditional stylistically. While Lancia's coupes may have been sleeker, their saloons were 3-box, square, and conservative. That isn't a bad thing, as they were still achingly elegant, but they were conservative, and by and large, that suited the traditional Lancia buyer. The Beta, in contrast, was 2-box, though still a saloon, and was all angles. It's rather brutal taken from any direction, especially with all the swages around the rear window and boot area. But I can't quite work out whether I actually really like it, or I'm just taken by the 70s-ness of the colour. I do like simple designs, and this is certainly that, with little bits of spice thrown in. Plus, just take a moment to drink in the colour of these seats. Marvellous. But I shan't waste any more of your time, because I know why you're all here. Right, we can't avoid it any longer. I'm going to have to say it. Rust. If you're British, over the age of 50, and are most importantly not a car enthusiast, you will remember Lancia for one thing: rust. Now, while every old person likes to say that every old car rusted, because they did, Lancia was a special case, and in the UK at least, the Lancia Beta made national press. It was 1978, 6 years after the launch of the Beta, when the world came crashing down around it. The British media began reporting that Beta front subframe mountings were rusting away, rendering the car scrap at just a few years old, and Lancia's PR team just decided to ignore it. In fact, Turin reportedly imagined it would blow over and everything would go back to normal, but it didn't. While every car rusted in the 70s, the fact that Betas were rusting structurally was of course a big deal, and the media went to town on them. The damage was so bad that Lancia were effectively forced into action, offering to buy back rusty Betas from their owners, and their image was annihilated. In spite of production changes and offering a 6-year anti-corrosion warranty, Lancia had failed in their biggest export market. They remained in the British market through to 1994, but they sold cars in very small numbers. In 2008, however, Fiat rolled out a new range of Lancias across Europe, but Britain didn't get them. Instead, the Lancia Delta was badged up as the Chrysler Delta, and I'm sure we're all familiar with the Chrysler 300C. The rest of Europe knows this thing as the Lancia Thema. Lancia's reputation in the UK was so scarred that they were scared of re-entering it, preferring an American name that had briefly entered the British market on a handful of occasions, usually rebadging British cars or bringing some truly horrific stuff over from the States, to a 10-time World Rally champion. Perception is extremely powerful, especially as it was the first series of Betas that were the rustiest, and those cars were built alongside the final Fulvias for 5 years, which are never tarnished with quite the same brush, and that's without even mentioning the famous Soviet steel. Some bloke down the pub might tell you that the Soviets paid for the rights to the Fiat 124 with substandard steel, which became Fiats and Lancias, and then became scrap. But this story is utter rubbish. The first hole in it is the existence of the Alfa Sud, often remarked to be a recipient of the Soviets' finest, but Alfa Romeo wasn't a part of the Fiat group until 1986, so the Soviet steel could not possibly have been the reason for that car's propensity to rust. Then there's the simple lack of any proof. While Fiat and the USSR did have a relationship, no transaction ever officially included steel as a payment, and the steel actually used can be traced back to Italian foundries. So if the Soviet Union isn't to blame, then who is? Well, there are a lot of factors. People like to dunk on the British motor industry's terrible labour relations during the 70s, but those people seem to have never met the Italians. If you think Red Robbo was scary, wait until you hear about the bomb threats and purposeful lowering of quality standards in order to showcase the workforce's importance. But of course, it would be childish to just look in one direction, because the design teams and accountants certainly didn't help. The quality of materials in a Beta versus those of a Fulvia is noticeably lower, as they had to chase every penny. And you could see that across the Italian motor industry in terms of how thin the steel was becoming and the general quality of interior plastics and upholstery. That's without mentioning design and production oversights that allowed for cars like this to begin rusting in some cases before they were even painted. It's not a topic I could begin to adequately cover in a video like this, but the result is that these beasts aren't just rare, they're endangered. And I'm only able to make this video today because of the preservation efforts of some brilliant enthusiasts. In the 1970s and at the beginning of the 80s, the Beta was Lancia. While other models were available, including run-out Fulvias and Flavias and the later Delta, the Beta was their lifeblood. It's amazing how perception can play such a massive role in how we view the past, because while the Beta did seriously hurt Lancia's international image, no doubt leading to its virtual death, without its existence, we wouldn't have had any Lancias at all. I mentioned at the beginning of the video our idea of Lancia being centred around the rallying success of the 70s, 80s and 90s. And I purposefully didn't include any of the earlier Lancias because the cars we really hold dear are the ones made possible by the initial success of the Beta. A few videos ago, I noted the importance of our ability to appreciate nuance. And the Lancia Beta, I feel, is the ultimate example of that. And on that note, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, then please do click like and subscribe to TwinCam as well. I'm forever indebted to my wonderful Patreon supporters, so if you'd like to support me that way, then please do follow the link in the description. And I'll have more videos coming along soon.